One now, but now it's going.
Okay. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Marco Sepik from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, and it's our great pleasure to have you today to discuss the emerging world order in this webinar, which shall last for today and tomorrow. We have two panels. Today's panel is about Europe and the emerging world order, and tomorrow's panel will be discussing China's role in the emerging world order, coordinated by my colleague, Professor Fabio Morosini. And for today's panel, we'll have my dear friend, Professor Adrian Bonilla, who is the director of the Europe Latin American Foundation in Hamburg, and also professor at the Flaxo system in Ecuador, and Professor Dr. Gisela Müller-Brandeck-Bucke from the University of Würzburg in Germany, and Dr. Caroline Rüger, also from the University of Würzburg, and Professor Luo Tianhong, my dearest friend, from the Renmin University, where she teaches international studies and also is a co-director of the Center for the European Studies of Renmin. We thank all the team, and especially Bruna Reisdorfer, who is helping us today. And the proceedings will be very simple. Professor Adrian will share his comments first, and then Professor Gisela Müller-Brandeck and also Dr. Caroline Rüger will share the presentation, and they will be joining in the same presentation. And we'll finish up with Professor Luo Tianhong from Beijing. And it's just to remind our audience through the YouTube, after that, you may send some comments or questions. And very briefly, the professors will try to answer your questions so we can keep up with the time frame we agreed to conduct this session today. Well, without any further delay, please, Professor Adrian Bonilla, share your comments with us about Europe and the emerging world order from a Latin American perspective as well. Thank you. You need to open your mic, Adrian.
Thank you very much, Marco, to you and to the colleagues of the Universidad Federal de Rio Grande do Sul for this invitation. The purpose of this presentation is to try to identify the contextual elements in the global scenario that allow us to characterize the relationship between Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Conventional approaches view this diversification process of geopolitical centers as an issue of transfer or acquisition of power, while in reality, what we are looking at are economic processes that have more to do with technological transformations, the diffusion of productive technology, and social organization and cohesion processes, rather with the automatic drives of states. Nonetheless, we are indeed currently witnessing the constitution of two centers in the world. One that continues to be for the foreseeable future located in Europe and North America, and another in the Asia Pacific. The consequences of this process mark the intensity and depth of international relations and tend to shape the foreign policy of many countries. They determine the capacities and limitations of decisions, and also areas of influence of other states and their economies. In this environment, the realist attribution of human personality to the states does in fact not contribute much to understand the current situation. In literature, this attribution is called a pathetic fallacy. I would like to point out that the characterization of economic and consequently political processes could be more useful to explain in the contemporary international order. What has Europe had in the past and does not have now that explain this image of loss of power. In reality, the economic, demographic, cultural, and defense capabilities of the European Union countries have not declined. What has happened is that other societies have diversified their own capabilities. The European domestic governance model that led to the construction of national states and was replicated globally in its republican and monarchical forms under liberal premises from the 18th century on, is not the only existing in the 21st century. In fact, the majority of the planet's population live in political societies that cannot be called liberal. Equally under siege are the fundaments of national secularism and the idea of free competition as the ideal form of capitalism. This century has not ceased to belong what we could call the West. However, its political and economic forms are not the only ones. The idea of the decline of Europe or the United States does not really express the contemporary international order, since it is not its decline that explains the emergence of other global economies, but rather the dissemination of capabilities in a scenario of interconnections. An additional element that has to do with global transformation is the evidence that the domestic and international political regimes of the 20th century have not been transformed at a rate similar to that of the global productive and financial structures. The crisis of 2008, which especially plunged the Atlantic economies into recessive dynamics, also challenged its political systems. The European Union, as an international regime, confronts organized critical contestation in all its states, and the United States, at least in the last 4 years, questioned all the premises of its alliances and consensuses created after the Second World War. The outbreak of contemporary nationalism and xenophobia, for example, that pressure decision-making processes is an inevitable phenomenon to consider in the domestic dynamics of both sides of the North Atlantic. What we knew as globalization did not exclusively involve the growth of the links and interconnections between societies, but also challenges the forms of global governance and the stability of political regimes. From a liberal perspective, the resilience and adaptability of authoritarianism to structural challenges is part of the explanation for the diversification of global centers of power. If the trends of the first 2 decades of this century persist, at least until 2050, 4 of the 5 largest world economies will not belong to the center of the Atlantic. From conventional views, the phenomenon we are experiencing has been identified as a challenge to the West. If this were the case, it is evident that relative power in economic and political terms, and to a lesser extent in defense, is being derived to other global scenarios. In this logic, Europe, which has been constructed from these visions always as the quintessence of the West, would be losing relevance. It is my opinion that this analysis is still incomplete and extremely basic for several reasons. In the first place, the idea of the West is a construction that has always been questioned in the international relations discipline because despite the expansion of European political and economic forms to the entire globe, in the last 500 years, never, at least until the constitution of the European Union, there was a political and military unity in that Western bloc. 500 years of interstate violence and 2 world wars are more than enough evidence to support this statement. If by the West we understand the alliance of the United States and some European countries to contain the Soviet Union, we would facing a far more limited dimension of what it entails, confusing a civilization classificatory concept, the West, with a political agreement, stable but not immutable, support this wrong image. In this sense, there is neither the rise nor the decline of the West, because the West is not a military agreement like NATO or a collective security regime like the United Nations, nor is it that Europe gross domestic product, for example. Its defense capacity of its cultural production has decreased in absolute terms in recent decades. If those were the indicators of decline, the reality of the data that does not reflect it. The contemporary world simply witnessed the growth of other economies at faster rates. The balance of power ideology does not account for a process that is far more complex than the Athenian war with Sparta some 1,000 years ago. The emerging global order presents a series of challenges that do not refer exclusively to the military capacity of the states or even their economic strength, but have to do, for example, with the dynamics of non-state actors, economic flows, and demographics, cohesion of their societies and their governmental capacity. If those were the indicators, then Europe, yes, faces a very complex scenario that defines its priorities according to its urgencies. However, considering the construction of Europe as a political identity implies a series of additional problems in both conceptual and empirical terms. Europe has a political existence as a region composed of different heterogeneous state units with limited agendas. Strictly speaking, Europe cannot be constructed as a nation state for analytical purposes. Posing the decline of Europe and comparing it, for example, with the rise of China or India does not account for an existing reality, not even as an intersubjective construction. If we consider the European Union in classical terms as an entity articulated by the idea of a common security agenda or an integrated and unitary economy, we will find that national diversities make albeit frequently the supranational identity. The social identities derived from the set of meanings that we can attribute to the region and to the European Union as the body of international representation have to be relativized to the fragmentation of the same idea of representation, but at the national level. At the political level, the consensus on the operating rules of an ideal liberal republic is constantly being challenged by domestic dynamics that are clearly expressed, for example, against the institutional framework of the European Union. Nationalisms, ethnic exclusions, xenophobia are some of the dynamics that complicate the scenario of the region and its political architecture. In short, neither the West nor Europe are categories that can shed light on the recomposition of capacities at the global level. We can identify large geolocated regions such as the North Atlantic or the Asia-Pacific as the two new world centers of confluence of these capacities to illustrate what the realists would call power, but we need an approach beyond the concept of nation-state power to understand the contemporary global system. Considering all these elements, I believe that the European Union must be conceived on the world stage as an actor with an institutional framework different from that of national states. If the level of analysis is the international system of states, we can talk about the emergence of several countries and the strength of others. The German capabilities, for example, have been those of a stable society with a global projection, and so the French or the British states. But if the point is to understand a global order beyond states, then the geo-referenced areas already mentioned are the most pertinent units of analysis. In this dimension, European affinities with Latin America and the Caribbean are mediated by the relationship is historically constructed from the past, which means that is a set of societies more akin to Latin American and Caribbean agendas, which is normal in a group as diverse as the European Union. Relations between both regions had an intense degree of institutionalization at the beginning of the last decade as a consequence of the more cohesive moment of CELAC, the Latin American Community of States, and also of what at that time was seen in the literature as the discrete withdrawal of Washington from the region. 10 years later, the intensity of the relationship is less explicit in the case of Europe than Latin America and the Caribbean. Despite the data suggesting that the countries of the European Union grouped together continue to be the main direct investor in the region. It is interesting to note, however, that the image of the Chinese presence is much more visible despite the fact that the European incidence has a greater degree of material support. Economy, diplomacy, agreements, and educational exchange, for example, are showing us this intense European presence in Latin America and the Caribbean. The European Union, on the other hand, faces challenges that come from the domestic construction of its political agendas. Migration and violent conflicts in the periphery are, for example, 2 points that overshadow other issues of international relations. The region's ability to play a global role, which is demanded of the European Union as it were a national state, goes through the construction of global consensus, which is more likely to happen with like-minded societies. It would seem that the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean could be strategic partners. But again, and with this I conclude, the state units of analysis in terms of capacities and power, informed by renewed visions of realism, do not grasp the complexity of that international order or allow us to identify Europe in that logic. The approach should be more social directed and refer to heterogeneous and diverse constellations of interest that are globally scattered in a world that right now might not belong to anyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Very good points. And I will move forward to Professor Gisela Müller-Brandegg and Dr. Caroline Rüger for the presentation. They are going to share with us a presentation. And please.
You can see it?
Yes, I can.
Excellent.
And I think our audience can see it through the YouTube.
Okay, so thank you once again for this invitation and opportunity to talk to you. And Caroline and me, we want to talk about the role of the European Union in this emerging world order. Concretely, we are talking about the mosaic of EU foreign policy, and we will have here you see the outline of our presentation that we do together. First, I want to talk a little bit of the new challenges for European Union in this world of change. I just start with a quote. The signs are increasing that the international order as we know it will be dissolved and replaced, wrote Hans Maul from SVP. So I just want to make the point, we are living in a changing world order, and this changing world order is to a large amount triggered by the welcome, so positively connoted, rise of emerging powers such as China, India, Brazil, and others. So by the rise of the emerging world. So this is changing world order, and I would say this is a positive aspect. But at the same time, world order is changing at present times, although due to the return of authoritarianism, nationalism, protectionism, and populism, which puts a democracy or democratic governance under pressure. This means for the European Union, this means for the this comes for the European Union as a real huge challenge, because the European Union as a political construction of a very specific kind, we call it sui generis, is more dependent than normal nation states on a rules-based international order, on democratic rule, mutual trust, and a functioning multilateral system. The EU, because it is this unique union of states, needs a multilateral rules-based international surrounding for its own survival, security, and prosperity. You maybe know this term of multilateralism is in the EU's DNA. So the present international context comes as a huge challenge for the EU, the world's second largest democracy of the world. In fact, the EU and like-minded countries bear the responsibility to uphold a multilateral system beneficial to international cooperation and problem solution. The question, all these challenges have driven, this is our main argument, in the last years, have driven the EU in the last years to sensibly alter its foreign policy approach. There is now a clear commitment of the EU to become a stronger actor on the international stage and to make better use of the numerous instruments at its disposal. The overall goal of this new approach is to create a safe surrounding for the EU, its member states, its citizens, and to contribute to a peaceful multilateral world order and a reformed global governance. We can see this commitment of the European Union in the global strategy for the European Union, adopted in 2016, Shared Vision, Common Action, A Stronger Europe. So when you have a closer look at this, at the global strategy, next one, please, you can see, which was mainly written by former High Representative Federica Mogherini. Here you can read the main goal of this strategy. It nurtured the ambition of strategic autonomy for the European Union, who wants to promote the common interests of our citizens and our principles and values. And we know, she writes, that all this is best served in the international system based on rules and on multilateralism. So the European Union is committed to promote a reformed global governance, one that can meet the challenges of the 21st century. So we now know that a rules-based liberal, which means free, and multilateral world order is in the EU's DNA. This is the new self-understanding of the European Union to make full use of its potential. And so we have this new foreign and security policy approach. But in the preface to this global strategy, Mogherini writes, as European Union, our potential is unparalleled. We are not making full use of this potential yet. So our questions are, what in fact are these unparalleled foreign policy potentials of the European Union, and how to make full use of them in order to contribute better to a future world order. So this is, now I give the word to Caroline.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also hello from my side, and thank you for the invitation. I will give you now an overview of what we call the multidimensional mosaic of EU foreign policy. And I want to start by telling you what was the starting point, the point of departure in establishing this model of EU foreign policy. We recognized, as many of you do, I guess, that when people talk about the European voice in international affairs, when they say the EU speaks with too many voices, as you can see here in this cartoon, they often just look at security and defense issues, also known as the hard core of EU foreign policy. In other words, people mostly look at the CFSP and the CSDP, the Common Foreign and Security Policy and the Common Security and Defense Policy. And yes, it is true, these are important elements of EU foreign policy, but this is definitely not the entire picture of EU in the world. There is, we can say, a curtailed perception of EU foreign policy and the reduction to CFSP and CSDP. As you can see, I put some quotes. Europe still has no single foreign policy voice. The world's great no-show on the international stage, and so on and so on. And what we did, our aim was to establish a model that encompasses each and every aspect of EU foreign policy and of the EU's contribution to global governance, at least its potential contribution. So we came up with this mosaic of EU foreign policy, and maybe, if I may, I would just answer to Professor Bonilla. Maybe this is start of an analytical framework that goes beyond the nation state, that gives us the opportunity to get a grasp of an international actor which is not a nation state. The concept follows, the mosaic follows the concept of multidimensionality. So let's have a look what this means. We have different mosaic tiles. We talk about different dimensions in this model. At first, we have the intergovernmental dimension. Essential elements, I've already said that, CFSP and CSDP. The Common Foreign and Security Policy means essentially political and diplomatic intergovernmental cooperations. These are EU declarations on international crises and global issues, the regular dialogue with third countries. And the Common Security and Defense Policy is more or less the operational arm. Since 2003, we have had over 30 civilian and military missions worldwide. And in this intergovernmental dimension of EU foreign policy, the member states call the shots, they dominate. Decision-making is mainly via unanimity. And of course, there is a certain degree of denationalization. You may know this famous term of Brusselsization. So denationalization without using the supranational method, without having the European Commission, European Parliament, and so on board, but nevertheless denationalization. But all in all, it's the member states who have the say. The next dimension is what we call the community dimension. This dimension follows a completely different decision-making regime. The community dimension consists of EU trade policy, which is an integral part of the foreign policy of the economic giant EU. Development cooperation and humanitarian aid. The EU and its member states are the largest donors in this realm worldwide. And the governance in this community dimension mainly follows the supranational community method. This means a central role for the European Commission, co-decision of European Parliament and Council, and mostly qualified majority voting. This dominates this dimension. As you can see, the next mosaic tile has mixed colors. it is a mixture of the intergovernmental and the supranational sphere and the supranational dimension. Sanctions or restrictive measures, as the treaty calls them, are decided anonymously by member states and implemented by means of the community dimensions, for example, via trade policy. And in 2017, the Estonian Council presidency established this very helpful EU sanctions map. I can't go too deep into that, but I just wanted to point this out to you because it's very helpful. And here we can see all the sanctions currently implemented by the European Union. And as you can see, it has just been updated on the 16th of October. Many of you will know that research on sanctions and mainly on the effectiveness of sanctions, this is a difficult business, but we can definitely say that the EU has hard power via sanctions and via its economic clout. Let's move on to the next dimension. We call it the sui generis dimension. It is sui generis because imagine a nation state having enlargement of its own territory as a constitutional principle. Enlargement of its own territory as a constitutional principle sounds kind of dodgy for a nation state, doesn't it? It's not dodgy for the European Union. Enlargement is, as the former commissioner for the European Neighborhood Policy and Enlargement, Stefan Füle, said, the most important transformation instrument the EU has. Camelia Ratio called it EU soft power at its best. So this is definitely true for enlargement policy, but we know enlargement policy has its limits. And this is why the EU in 2004, notably just after the Big Bang enlargement of 2004, it came up with the idea of the European Neighborhood Policy. Bad tongues call this simply an enlargement avoidance policy. The objective was and is, according to former Commission President Prodi, to establish a ring of friends around the EU. And here you can see all the countries that are part of the European Neighborhood Policy. A ring of friends, if we think about that and match this image with the map, the Economist called it quite accurately more a ring of fire. And this was in 2014, this statement by the Economist. Shortly after the Arab Spring, that put the southern neighborhood in turmoil, that triggered the war in Syria. 2014, we were amid the Ukraine crisis and the Crimea annexation. But now we are in 2020 and the picture didn't get better. Add to that in 2020, Armenia and Georgia, or the drilling conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean. So another look on the map, you can see it's more an arc of instability and insecurity than a ring of friends. The last big dimension, and this is often forgotten, but it is immensely important in our view, is the external dimension of internal policies. We have here the external aspects of the area of freedom, security, and justice. This is mainly migration and asylum policy. Climate policy, of course, and the external energy policy. And there is also this take it all time in this yellow dimension. It encompasses all internal policies with external aspects. The euro, for example, which is a prime example for that. And Federica Mogherini referred to this important but often neglected dimension when she said, there is not one single internal priority of the European Union that it is not linked to an external dimension. So this is the mosaic of EU foreign policy as we got it out of the treaties, out of the Lisbon Treaty. And as you can see, one mosaic tile is still missing. I haven't talked about that yet. It's the agreements and partnerships of the EU worldwide. They form the centerpiece of EU foreign policy and are implemented by means of all dimensions. This explains the four colors of this tile. And it is very important to note that the EU foreign policy mosaic is profoundly anchored in a normative foundation. which can mainly be found in Article 21. What does this mean? It means the promotion of values of human rights, rule of law, freedom, democracy, gender equality, and so on. This is not a separate mosaic tile in our framework, but guides, or at least shall guide, EU foreign policy in each and every aspect. We all know that the EU also at home does not always live up to this goal, but which international actor does actually? So what do we have when we look at the balance sheet of the mosaic? On the strengths side, EU foreign policy provides a toolbox with a multitude of instruments and policies. With this toolbox, the EU has at least the potential to be a world power. Former Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker coined the German term Weltpolitikfähigkeit. This means, translated, the ability to act credibly and effectively on the global stage. On the challenge side, on the other hand, the EU is a global actor with a fragmented profile and with different regimes of decision-making. The unanimity and CFSP and CSDP can still be regarded as an essential Achilles heel of EU foreign policy. And there have been some high-level initiatives to introduce majority voting now in the Council. It would also be legally possible even without treaty change, but let me say, QMV is not a panacea. It will not make the intergovernmental realm perfect. Maybe we can come back to that point in the discussion. And now we move on to part 3 of our presentation.
So now it's me again. So we come to this part, the EU in a changing world order, striving for European sovereignty and strategic autonomy. So we up to now have already heard a lot about EU's global strategy and what it means really. Caroline explained it to us when we say the EU has a lot of potential, but it doesn't make use of it in an appropriate way yet. So, and this is exactly changing in the last years. So we heard about these terms of strategic autonomy, that the European Union wants to contribute to a reformed global governance. And this is, if you want, state of the art 2016. Now I want to give you some more hints on how this blueprint of the global strategy has evolved further in the very recent years and led to a new overall concept. Here, once again, a German term, Leitbild, for the international role of the European Union. And this new overall concept is, following our analysis, a sovereign European Union as the power which defends multilateralism. And here you see already the contribution the EU wants to make to this emerging future and new world order. So when we want to reconstruct this new Leitbild overall concept, we have to have a look at the main or very important actors within European Union, the famous Franco-German engine for integration. And just to be brief, I want to reconstruct this new overall concept. Here we have to have a look at the famous speech of French President Emmanuel Macron in September 2017, when in a real, very important speech, an initiative for Europe, a sovereign, equitable, and democratic Europe, he explained what his concept of future of the European Union. But the most important is that he coined the term of European sovereignty, which includes a European foreign and defense policy, protection of external borders, etc. But I just want to stress that he invented, if you want, the term of European sovereignty, not French sovereignty or German sovereignty or shared sovereignty, but European sovereignty. And the next slide, please. The contribution of Germany to this new overall concept was given by Chancellor Angela Merkel when she, in an interview, stressed Europe should be perceived as a strong voice among global actors. It should be clear that we are the force that strengthens multilateralism. And normally, European politics mean that if Germany and France find a compromise, here the example is constructing a new overall concept. The other countries normally join in. I just want to show you here that this commitment to a new overall concept can be found also in the Treaty of Aachen, which is the new Franco-German Friendship Treaty, replacing the famous Élysée Treaty, you know. So here we can read of the commitment of the Franco-German obligation to advocate for a united, efficient, sovereign, and strong European Union. And they stress the firm commitment on a rules-based order based on multilateralism. So we can see that this new concept, which is also a self-understanding of the European Union concerning its international order, finds an expression too in Jean-Claude Juncker, who picked up this term of European sovereignty in his last State of the Union speech. He called it the hour of European sovereignty. And here, once again, Caroline already mentioned it, he requested the EU to develop Weltpolitikfähigkeit once more as the ability to act credibly and effectively on the global stage. Funny, when you have to translate Weltpolitikfähigkeit, it's longer than the German word of Weltpolitikfähigkeit. And this is what the EU is striving for. Another example would be the famous alliance for multilateralists, which German and French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian and Heiko Maas launched in April 2019. This alliance for multilateralism is meant as a network of like-minded states in order to defend multilateralism against all the present threats and damages. So this alliance for multilateralism counts at present around 60 participants, and it will be for students of international relations or European studies very interesting to follow how these alliance for multilateralism will develop. But when both foreign ministers launched it, they asked who to defend multilateralism, if not us, when, if not now. So this is once again an expression of this new or developing overall concept, which is stressed once more by the new Commission of Ursula von der Leyen.
And this is where I take over again. The call for European sovereignty and strategic autonomy got even louder when the new leadership team of the European Union came to office in 2019. In November 2019, Ursula von der Leyen presented her new geopolitical commission to the European Parliament. And she said in her speech, countries from east to west, from south to north, need Europe to be a true partner. We can be the shapers of a better global order. This is Europe's vocation. My commission will not be afraid to speak the language of confidence, but it will be our way, the European way. This is the geopolitical commission that I have in mind and that Europe urgently needs. This geopolitical thread is woven through the entire structure of the commission and was visible, for example, in the mission letters to the commissioners designate. Another actor in the leadership team is Jeanmichel, the European Council president. He also echoed this call for strategic autonomy, even said strategic autonomy for Europe, this is the aim of our generation. And he referred to the toolbox of EU foreign policy and says we have solid instruments at our disposal. We must make more use of them, and we must make better use of them. He refers then to the capacity to set standards. For example, regarding the use of chemical substances, standards worldwide, the GDPR for the protection of privacy online, or the definition of hate speech in global platforms. And certainly, last but not least, Josep Borrell, HRVP, High Representative Vice President of the Commission, he coined the often echoed term that the EU has to learn to use the language of power. This was already in his hearing in the European Parliament in October 2019, and at the Munich Security Conference in February 2020. He added that the EU must develop an appetite for power. What does this mean, actually? In Borrell's perception, the language of power is certainly military, but not only. It is a constraining power. If an actor speaks the language of power, it can make decisions that restrict or constrain others. And this constraining idea, this constraining power, is relatively new for the European Union, which is more used to leading by example and not by force. And this principle, leading by example, has shaped EU action for decades, but Borrell and the leadership team, they want not only influence for the EU, but power. And this leads us to our last part of this presentation, the quintessential question: can the EU speak the language of power? Can it actually play in this big power play, in this big global power play? In other words, does the EU walk the talk? We put here Jacques Delors and his nice sentence: we must reconcile Sunday's speeches with Monday's actions. So what we will do now in the remainder of the presentation is to put the new narrative leitmotif of EU foreign policy to the test. What is on the action side? Can the EU be a serious actor? Can the EU play power politics? When we talk about power politics, the obvious thing that comes to mind is security. And we have already pointed out that European coherence on that matter is far from perfect. It is intergovernmental. Member states call the shot. They are often disunited, but there was a lot going on in the last 5 years. And I can only tell you some buzzwords. Maybe we can come back to them in the discussion. PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, the European Defense Fund, and the Strategic Compass, which is ongoing at the moment. It is a key objective of the German Council Presidency of 2020. And we must not forget that EU foreign policy, especially in the realm of security, is made up of 27 nation states, 27 different cards. And this allows, on the plus side, as many people say, a 360-degree view around the world with all its assets, but on the negative side, an often cited lack of strategic culture. And therefore, following and based on the European Global Strategy, the EU has just started to establish this strategic compass. HRVP Borrell shall present a joint threat analysis by December 2020. We can stay tuned on that. And it's good to have an update and precision to the 2016 document, because there were important developments since then.
Yes, Caroline just talked about the new narrative of EU foreign policy, and we just have to see that a couple of very important developments of recent years pushed the EU further to strive for a stronger role or stance on the international stage. Evidently, Brexit. I will not elaborate on this. Everybody knows that losing the United Kingdom is a very big affair for the European Union. On the other hand, we have growing tensions in the transatlantic relations in the Trump election. And we have, as we said already, increasing tendency of authoritarianism worldwide, a phenomenon which is increasing. So I want just now to answer, or starting to answer the question, does the EU walk the talk? I just want to give you a couple of examples where you can see changes in the European Union policies. So we, Caroline and me, we think that the EU is under the way to learn, to try to learn. We do not know yet how to speak the language of power. Just a couple of examples. EU-China Strategic Outlook of 2019, where for the first time in very clear words, the European Union is calling China a partner, an economic competitor, but also a systemic rival, promoting alternative models of governance. Another sign of a new approach is the attempt to save or maintain the nuclear agreement with Iran by creating a new instrument to avoid American sanctions, this instrument for supporting trade exchanges. You have a third attempt to create a stronger European Union, with the European Commission trying to enhance the international role of the euro. And to give you just two more examples, we have since last year discussions about how to create a real European, so common European industrial policy. Just a couple of days ago, the Commissioner Breton presented a European strategy on data. So here you see signs of a changing self-understanding of Europe. But maybe my last example, where I will elaborate a little bit more on it, is the prime example for a stronger Europe, the proposals to install a European carbon border adjustment mechanism. As a real perfect example for what Caroline said, that European Union must move from being a normative power to becoming a constraining power. What is the context? We have climate change as a global threat calling for an effective multilateral governance. Everybody knows this. We know that the Paris Agreement is under the way of being dismantled, mainly due to US, American, and others withdrawals or watering down. We have, on the other hand, the European Green Deal of December 19, enhancing substantially the EU's contribution to fight climate change, with the goal of climate neutrality for the European Union until 2050. But we know that, on the other hand, the EU is responsible only for 7% of global CO2 emission. So what is clear, EU's efforts must therefore go far beyond measures on European soil. And here we come to the next slide and the idea of later constraining power. Here you can see that the European Union is still a big emitter, but compared to others, this is not, by measures on European soil, this is not the way to effectively fight climate change. So the idea, next one please, the idea of introducing a European carbon border adjustment mechanism follows the idea that first, European companies shall be protected against unfair competition from other states and countries by introducing a mechanism, let's say by introducing a tax who will protect European companies on the one hand side, but also these mechanism will or could incite other countries to fulfill their Paris engagements in order to avoid tax paying. I must admit that as many questions concerning this planned mechanism remain still open, but it would be an example, and you see the will of the European Union to develop constraining power, not only by being an example, a model, but also to incite others to follow the way. note here, the Brazilians know it very well, that the EU-Mercosur trade agreement is just under the way of failure because of missing environmental protection measures. Let's come now to our conclusion. What role for the EU? Yeah, maybe we can come back to this provocative picture later. I just want to conclude with the next slide. By striving for a stronger role in world politics, the EU might operate as a game changer against this competition of USA and China, which was already mentioned. A stronger role includes the defense of European interests and values. And as we try to explain, such a stronger role implies that the EU makes full use of its potentials and furthermore learns to speak the language of power. The outcome of both prerequisites for such a stronger role, however, still remain uncertain. Here still we have the problem of the law, Sunday speech and Monday actions. But a stronger Europe could spur a better emerging world order in the terms of defending democracy, human rights, gender equality, is to support and defend a rules-based, free, liberal, multilateral world order. And this is, I think, the contribution of the European Union, which is even more urgently needed in times of COVID-19 pandemic. Caroline, we will make the real conclusion. No.
I will just give the floor to Commission President von der Leyen to make a concluding conclusion for our presentation, and I will quote her: "This is an unsettled world where too many powers only speak the language of confrontation and unilateralism. But it is also a world where millions of people are taking to the streets to protest against corruption or to demand democratic change. The world needs our leadership more than ever. To keep engaging with the world as a responsible power, to be a force for peace and for positive change, we must show our partners at the United Nations that they can rely on us as a champion of multilateralism." Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professors Gisela and Caroline. I now will allow the floor for Professor Luo Tianhong. Tianhong, your microphone is in mute. Okay, now. And Bruna, please share the presentation.
Okay, thank you for the invitation again. And I think my presentation tried to answer the similar question raised by the previous presentation. And the topic actually, if I gave some explanation, I tried to use the language just has been mentioned. I want to discuss a question, the EU's part in the weakening of the old liberal world order, and especially it's a strategy towards not so like-minded countries, like Russia, like maybe also Turkey included, and of course China. And if this sort of new version of Europeans' strategy, or the Europeans try to develop its constraining power, what's the effect of this new direction? So the topic is realpolitik with European characteristics and its impact on emerging world order. Next slide, please. Actually, when the last presentation using Mosaic, I will use a more bigger term, grand strategy. This is the term used by some European scholars in the discussion before the EUGS has been released. And afterwards, it's just also going on. And we can also see from this new strategy, the direction is quite clear. Your EU is trying to strengthening its strategic autonomy. And actually, I want to take the case of Ukraine crisis to see how much this new direction has worked. Next slide, please. Well, if we compare the Europe's strategy in 2003 and the strategy in afterwards in 2016, we can see actually it's not so bold and confident like the old version. The new version of the European global
I think we have a problem. Professor Luo, audio and video has stopped. Let's give a moment so the connection will be restored. Jianhong, unfortunately, I think Professor Luo will need to reconnect. Let me take the opportunity to explain to our audience that to put in place this webinar represents a real challenge for the time zones. We have people in 4 different continents participating in these 2 days, in Latin America, Brazil, Europe, specifically in Brazil, Europe, China, and Australia, and different parts of those countries. So hopefully Professor Lu will be able to reconnect with us in a moment. Okay. I think let me see. Yep. Okay. Let's give just another minute. Professor Luo has exited the room and will be re-entering briefly. We do have a couple of questions already sent by the audience, and we may start registering those questions and also some of my comments, and then we'll finish hearing Professor Luo Tianhong as soon as she is able to rejoin us. Well, I first would like to thank again our participants and for the comprehensive and very instigating questions. Some of the topics we are covering today by your presentations are ongoing problems and challenges. So there's no final answer for the questions you are raising. And therefore, in my comments, I intend to add more questions rather than help to answer them. But I think the common theme here is how prepared are all of us in terms of individuals, nations, institutions, how prepared are we to deal with this new emerging order? A new emerging order is not only the offering or the supply side presented by countries, institutions, and companies, but also the demand side of big problems that are not capable of being solved by any single actor in the international system. And I think you both, the both presentations mentioned so far a couple of these big problems that are truly global and demand cooperation. Let's see if Professor Luo can join us now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Tianhong. I think I will just stop my video and mute my microphone, and you please go ahead and just try to orient Bruna about the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for this difficulty. The fourth slide, please. The fourth page. The next page, please.
Oh, it seems a problem with the connection again. Yeah, unfortunately, we are not being able to hear Professor Luo. It's almost 9 p.m. in Beijing, probably the connection. Xiaohong, if you can hear me, I suggest you try to change your network. I don't know if it's possible or not. Meanwhile, I'll okay.
Okay.
No. No, I'm sorry, Xiaohong, we cannot hear you. Well, Bruna, I think you please talk with Professor Luo to see if she can restore her connection. And I will go ahead and finish up the 2 or 3 comments I would like to make. And we'll see which questions the audience have. And as soon as Professor Luo is able to reconnect, we'll try to listen to her final, the proper presentation. Well, I was mentioning that I don't have any better answers than yourselves, but either the question of which kind of restored world order can the EU help to build or to rebuild is, I think, the biggest question. There's some in all the presentations, there is some implication that either multilateralism or liberal aspects, the individual rights, human rights, and gender equality are the main contributions in terms of value projections that you can help the world right now. And from my understanding of your presentations, those possibilities are linked with the restoring capacity of the EU and the European countries and the European societies to solve some of the internal problems, rising inequality, rising authoritarianism, and a rapid transformation from the technological innovation are across the board problems that happens to be challenging European societies as well. So a sort of strong liberal democratic profile needs to be established within the European Union right now as a condition for to transform those aspects of a supranationalism framework into a proper sovereign country. So a sovereign projection of power and values need to solve these problems internally. And I don't know if there's new institutional aspects and changes regarding the foreign policy and the defense and security policy, they are capable of translating this internal challenge, not only Brexit, but the rise of the far right and xenophobia and lack of solidarity in terms of taxing and how to deal with migrants. And as the professors mentioned, there's sort of a ring of fire or ring of friends in East, South, and also with NATO needs to be addressed with a sort of less ambitious expectations in terms of the liberal democratic rules applying for those countries. So to be more neutral and constructive in terms of development and helping not only to use the economic clout to force better environmental policies, for instance, but also to help the development and incorporation of those. In the global scenario, I think the strongest contribution EU is giving us is to uphold and sustain a rules-based multilateral system that is under attack, especially by the competition between the United States and China, but also by the protectionist response from all countries that feel that the globalization didn't work for them. So I wonder if the sustainable development goals can be a sort of minimal program that unifies the world, and the EU and the Europe's role in promoting those sustainable development goals and helping others would be a stabilizer for giving some space for the EU to solve its internal problems in order to stabilize and build a better international order, better than the one we have right now, which is in shambles, right? So basically, what means a reformed global governance from your perspective? And if you disaggregate the sustainable development goals in terms of environment, people, and infrastructure, especially the digital one, I think what you have presented as an ambition from European Union is in line with the greatest demands of global governance right now. So I would like to hear from you about that. And finally, there are a couple of questions from the audience. The first one would be, how do you think Brexit is affecting EU foreign and defense policy? And the second question is also related with this internal travails of the EU regarding the armed forces. If you are seeing a superseding of the common security and defense policy based on the joint Franco-German arrangements for building a force projection capability that would sustain these engagements outside. A more specific question comes from the audience regarding how to deal with Lukashenko and Belarus right now, after the example of trying to shape the results of the Ukrainian crisis. And in which way the Western-centric conceptualization of the world will be challenged by the dislocation of the dynamic centers of economic and social development to the Asia-Pacific region. How to combine this Western image with other values like equality or development that are also important for the rest of the world. So I think we have a couple of questions that now allows Professor Bonilla and Gisela and Caroline to elaborate a little bit more of their presentations. And we are also expecting Professor Lula to rejoin us as soon as possible. Thank you very much. I don't know if you go in the same order. Adrian, you'd like to start, and then we move to Caroline and Gisela.
Okay, yeah, my video is...
Yeah, we can hear you, but we
Yes,
cannot see you.
you have to allow my video to start.
Bruna, please allow.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Regarding your questions, what we want to know if it is possible to point out at this moment of the international development of politics, the idea of a world global liberal order as the outcome of the political process between the states, the nations, and the societies. I am not so sure about it. I think that we are living in a very fragmented world, in a very diverse world, and the idea of democracy from a liberal perspective is not shared by most of the world societies. If you look at the demographic map of the world, you will realize that most of the world population, I said it in my presentation, is not living under liberal democratic societies. But the conception, the liberal conception of democracy is not the only unique conception of that term. Since the Greeks to these days, we have had a lot of constructions about this world. So every society in the world sees itself and every state as a democratic one. And you cannot at this moment point out the idea of an ideal world founded under the principles of the Wilsonian democracy for the international order of the last century. So what we have to take into account is that we are going to live with different kind of societies and with different kind of political regimes. But that is not to say that we are going to eliminate the multilateralism as the way of dealing with the political processes and the economic processes in the world. I think the multilateral mechanisms are the only ones valid to process the needs of the world today. If you look at health, if you look at the economy, if you look at global warming, for example, you need multilateralism in order to process those global problems. And most of the societies of the world, with a couple of exceptions, believe in multilateralism as the way to solve most of the international problems. So I think that multilateralism is alive. What is not so alive is the liberal idea of democracy as the only one possibility of political regime in the world. You can have relationships and good relationships between different kinds of political regimes in this world, and you need for that multilateral mechanisms. So, yes, Europe, the European Union, and Latin America share both ideas. The idea of democracy as it was created in Europe 3 centuries ago, and share also the idea of multilateralism as the best way to deal with international problems. Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean have a lot of affinities, but the two that I have mentioned are probably the most important ones, despite the fact that we share a lot of commonalities in terms of trade, economy, and cultural relationships.
Thank you, Adrian. Gisela?
Yes, I want to answer or try to answer to some of the questions you addressed, or people from the public addressed internal European problems. Caroline mentioned this especially. Everybody knows that some of the European Union member states have problems with the idea of a liberal democracy and rules of law. I do not want to talk about Hungary and Poland now, but just to say one of the problems within European Union in the last decades was this kind of loss of an idea what Europe stands for in the world. And I think all this new narrative, which is just under the way to emerge under the threat of world disorder at the moment, is to reassure Europeans that the decision to join the European Union is the right one. For example, we have, within European studies, these long discussions on how we, the European Union, European member states, have lost the acceptance of the people in the last decades. This is one of the problems. If some countries like Great Britain, for example, they are convinced that they will do better out of the European Union than within the European Union, you have to ask what went wrong. Why didn't they understand? I mean, it was mentioned a couple times already by colleague Bonilla, for example, that at present times with the competition of big regions, world regions, small countries like European countries, and all European countries are small countries, they have to join forces on within the European Union. So I think a lot of internal problems of the European Union could be overcome if the sense of this unification of Europe would be better communicated by our societies, politicians, institutions, etc. And I think this would a lot help against Polish or Hungarian developments. With regard just to one more question to Brexit, how it will affect European Union. I mean, if you had listened to what Caroline and myself, we just said in our presentation, all the recent evolutions of European Union's foreign policy, this strive for a bigger, stronger role on the international scene, is some kind of result of the United Kingdom leaving us, or having left us. So you have immediate consequences. And one more point with regard to Brexit, when Caroline talked about the real progresses within CFSP and CSDP, these progresses like PESCO could only be reached because the British left us, because they all the time for decades were opposed a European Union becoming a stronger foreign policy actor. So Brexit is a terrible thing, and it's not over yet, but it opened up chances. And this new narrative, for example, which is just emerging, we do not know yet if it will last, but for the moment, it is due to Brexit. And maybe last remark on what you asked, Marco, about the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change and so on. I mean, we have the problem, and I take it very serious, that multilateralism, yes, Adrian, multilateralism will survive, but which kind of multilateralism? So if we say we must, as European Union, for example, help or contribute to stabilize the United Nations as a framework, for example, for sustainable development goals, this is very important. Look at the action of the United Nations with regard to the big conflicts of the last years, Syria, Libya. United Nations are not making a big point because they are not respected anymore, or not sufficiently, and because a reform of the United Nations is urgently needed. So, I mean, we cannot rely on the United Nations if the United Nations are not helped by their friends. And I think European Union and this Alliance for Multilateralism we talked about have to be considered as friends of the United Nations in order to put them back on center stage for the solution of big problems of our globalized world. I hope it was clear what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. It was very clear. Please, Caroline.
Yeah, if I pick and choose, I think the Lukashenko question is still open, so I would pick that one for first. I think in the last couple of days and weeks, we could have seen that the EU is very eager to point out that Belarus is not Ukraine 2.0. So it's not this geopolitical Russia versus the EU thing we had with regard to the Ukraine. And after the special European Council meeting on Belarus in August, all those involved stressed that this crisis was not a geopolitical one. And the EU is very eager to avoid Russia's logic of spheres of influence. And maybe this is wise, and maybe this also points in the direction of what you, Marco, said before on European neighborhood policy becoming more modest and not trying to transform everything, but more work towards this famous notion of resilience from the European global strategy. So this is my point on Belarus and on Lukashenko. And I would also like to comment on this question of problems at home. Yes, the European Union definitely has its issues. We have our issues with rule of law breaches and human rights possibilities. But as I said before, which international actor does not have these issues? So why shall the European Union be perfect just to be a credible actor on the global stage? We have to deal with these problems, and they are there, but it should not prevent the European Union on going globally and get a stronger role. Because I would also underline, as Gisela just said, that even if the majority is not for the liberal democratic model of global governance, then I don't know if it's the right way to let the majority decide. Sometimes it's also more about constraining power, leading by example. I don't know, all these concepts that led EU foreign policy in the past and will lead them in the future. So what I want to say is, if there are problems at home, we have to deal with them, but this is not a case for letting the EU's global role be left aside. And the last point, the EU has its problem with this new geopolitical role it plays. And there is a new book, I'm not sure if you have read it already, I've just read some parts of it, The Strongman, European Encounters with Sovereign Powers. And it also says Europe goes from being a referee to becoming a player. And this is something that will take some time. And the EU has to find its slot in this global governance. But in my I'm deeply convinced that the EU has to play a role and also try to prevail the orders of a rules-based and liberal multilateralism and global governance.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And thank you very much, Caroline. Luo, let's try again once more. Let's see if it works this time. Bruna, please share again the Professor Luo's presentation. Let's see if we can hear. Oh, unfortunately, we cannot hear you, Xianhong. Well, it is really a pity because Professor Luo can hear it and can see us and has a lot to share. She has been studying this subject for a long time and has presented a very good point. Oh, Professor, now I can see
Yes.
you.
Yes, can you hear me then?
Yes.
Now this time it works. You can hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So let's just, sorry for just taking too much time in this difficulty. I want to mention about EU's policy towards Crimea crisis. I think the liberal order has some challenges, is facing some challenges, both from inside and from outside. I think this crisis is sort of a test to see how to solve the problem to deal with a not so like-minded country in EU's neighborhood. So about Russia. And after this crisis, we all know, let's just directly move to the 6th page, the Crimea shock. After Crimea shock, next slide, please. So I think Ukraine crisis is a very strong case. I haven't done enough study on the case of Turkey, but I think my main point is actually it's very good, will be very good if EU can include Turkey inside EU. It's a sort of a liberal strategy. We can see the attraction of liberal strategy, but now we can see Turkey now is living away and even become a problem for the European Union, for the whole Europe. Anyhow, let's take the case of Crimea to see how to deal with Russia. Russia, next slide, please. How to comment this crisis. Anyhow, geopolitics has come back. Who should be blamed? On the one hand, the Russians are too bad. Russians to be blamed. But on the other side, is EU has any problem in solving this issue? I read some articles, and I also have some opinions on this, and I expect our European friends can give their comments to see if this analysis is strong enough, is solid enough. So, as far as I have seen, I think the enlargement to the east and Russia's perception. When we look at this, next slide, please. In 2004, when Europe released its neighborhood policy, I don't see much negative response from Moscow. I think it was only when the reality of the Eastern Partnership began to emerge in the wake of Georgian War in 2008 that Russians began to become alarmed. And the Russians' explanation is that both NATO enlargement and the emergence of CSDP have been theorized as contributing to the promotion of a zero-sum relation with Russia. And actually, I think the Russians think they have a solid reason to intensify their stance. Next slide, please. So there is a sort of contest between EU and the Russians. Putin's reaction is to build a Eurasia customs union, and the EU's response is to just ask the partnership countries to choose between Russians and the EU. So it's a sort of a very confrontational, it's a big contest at that time. And when the Ukraine crisis was happening, the inside Ukraine is also very divided. And then we all know the annexation of the Crimea. Next slide, please. So when we think about the European approach to the Eastern Partnership and Russia, we can see actually EU is adopting a sort of Eurocentrism way of doing things. So they don't doubt which way the partners would turn. They quite sure, the European Union is quite sure they should choose the EU. And they dismiss Russia as an almost irrelevant factor in the contest. This is quite arrogant towards the Russians, according to the Russians' understanding. And also the handling of this complex relationship actually is not strong enough, nor is not soft enough. Also, it's not so strong enough. So my observation is that the rhetorically speaking, it's quite impressive, it's quite strong, but the resources to be used is not so strong. And it's sort of a lack of precise intention towards Ukraine. It seems it don't want to make some confrontation, but actually it feels not in this way for the Russian side. And so my conclusion is this handling of the issue is neither liberal enough, is nor is also nor realistic enough. So I think the direction of the European grand strategy is a sort of when we have this crisis, the Europeans try to adopting a realpolitik with European characteristics, and is want to on the track of optimistic realist. This is the term I use from Swan Biscop is a scholar we have communicated. So I think this direction, when we look at this direction in the case of Russia, we can see Russia's challenge. Actually, it's a difficult case. Sanction is used, but it couldn't press down the Russians' ambition. Then what else should be done? How powerful? How to make it a constraining power? Let me use the term our two European friends had used. This is something I think really puzzled me. Next slide, please. So after that, we can see in its near border, next slide, please. EU is building a regional order. I think it's not so liberal. Now, actually, the atmosphere between the Russians and the EU is not so nice. And with Turkey also problematic. And of course, inside EU, it can remain a liberal order, but it also is facing some internal challenge. Next slide, please. Next, let's take the case of the relationship with China. We have already, just now, our two European friends have already mentioned this 2019 strategic outlook. And in this year, the official documents also have a very strong voice about their resentment towards the Chinese way of governance and economy and politics. I think we don't need to go further about these differences and disputes in terms of in terms of economy. The Europeans think China is doing a subsidized economy, while the Europeans are preferring a social market economy. And it's very critical towards the forced technology transfer. And I think a few days ago, or just lately, human rights issues were raised again. But normally, this is already in the discussion between the two sides, but not speak that openly and frankly. But I think the German representative is quite openly criticizing China for its action in Xinjiang. And also, I think Tibet is a great concern on Hong Kong and rule of law and so forth. So next slide, please. I think maybe this time, how to deal with China. Is China a threat to liberal world order? If we look at market economy, liberal democracy, and global governance, we can see EU and China are still partners, but at the same time, we can see EU is taking a hardened stance towards China. But when I see this emerging new world order and the current world situation, I do worry about the uncertainty and a great resentment towards the Chinese. I think the Chinese should think about their own problem. They have some problem in managing some issues, that's for sure. But on the other hand, I think nowadays liberal order also for many people means the Chinese should make a regime change. So this is I don't think when China is making an effort to involve in, to just engage in and integrate it into this world order. I think the original meaning of this liberal track is the Chinese understanding is definitely not that way. At this part, but is China still on the track of liberalism, or is try to building an internal liberal order? My answer is yes. So according to David Harvey, and he's saying that the Chinese version of liberalism is actually Deng Xiaoping's direction. And also, according to some liberals' judgment, like Joseph Nye, Eikenberry, they all think this is the liberal order for the Chinese is still in their benefits to join in. So my point is, this time it's also a case for the EU to use its strength to strengthen the liberal order when it's dealing with China. Before, in my understanding, EU has not done a very good job in including Russia and Turkey. But for the Chinese case, can we have a better management? I think, of course, you can be very critical towards China, but the general direction is still on the liberal track. So I will say maybe outside world has underestimated the extent of change inside China. It will be they are too quick to reach the conclusion that China is a threat. Sorry again, thank you for your attention, and I expect the response and the criticism from our friends.
Thank you very much, Tianhong. I'm very glad that we finally were able to hear you. Let me just add one question before we move to our colleagues. And we have a couple more minutes to wrap up this panel. So I think from a Latin American perspective, there are two big, gigantic problems in the world now: how to solve the climate change problem and preserve biodiversity and environmental policies, and how to decrease inequality and promote social development. I think on those two aspects, China and European Union have more to contribute to a reformed global order and to promote multilateralism in those two aspects than in specific security questions. Probably nowadays we have this big rift between China and European Union in some of these aspects. But as long as we reframe the question of human rights in general as including political and social rights and the environmental problems, the plans announced by the Chinese government are very ambitious in that sense, and they will need to be integrated in initiatives like Belt and Road. So how do you think which aspects of the cooperation between European Union and China would be more beneficial mutually and globally beneficial for the emerging world order?
I must say, I think China is in a very difficult position right now. Although the Chinese think they have done a great effort and do a good job, but the outside world seems not so satisfied, and they feel worried, and they even feel resented towards Chinese way of doing things. So I think whenever there is opportunity to cooperate, I think it's good. like the aspect of environmental protection, climate change, social equality. I think all those issues has been under discussion for a long time. It's not so new. And the Europeans and the Chinese have been in a good term for quite a long time. But of course, it's very understandable to have new problems, and the new quarrels can be discussed, can be negotiated. So I think now it seems it depends on our European friends to see how much we want to discuss. And the weakness of the Chinese side is that when it has some conflicts with outside world, the Chinese is very, very very sensitive, too much sensitive towards the criticism, not so used to criticism and attack. And it will lead to more confrontation. This is my big worry. So I think every opportunity of negotiation, discussion, and cooperation is good for the world, and is good for the Chinese. Most of it also be good for the Europeans. It should be. This is my answer.
Thank you very much, Tianhong. I think it's time for us to wrap up. I will give the floor to our participants for their final words. And beforehand, let me thank you again for the participation. It was quite a challenge for us to put this panel in place. And tomorrow morning, we have another panel on this webinar on China and the emerging world order. So please, Adrian, Caroline, and Gisela, and then Tianhong, share with us your final thoughts for today.
Thank you, Marco. Well, I am very grateful with you and with the university for this webinar, and very happy to have heard the excellent presentations of my colleagues. I just want to insist that we need to have an approach in order to understand the contemporary global order that should go beyond the system of national states. We have to take a look at the societies, because most of the transformations in the last decades came from the society, from the global society, and they are shaping the way the states perform in this contemporary global order. So if we want to understand it, we should go beyond the national state level of analysis. Of course, we have to look at it, but it is not really right now the driven dynamic that is shaping the world. But thank you very much. And if we have to understand Europe, we have to look at the European societies.
Thank you, Adrian. Gisela, please.
Yes, thank you very much once again to offer us this opportunity to communicate. We have very little time left, I suppose, but I just wanted to pick up what I already said in the last round. I think what we need urgently, and after the presentation of my colleague Tianhong, it's even clearer than ever, we have on a world level to discuss what do we understand under multilateralism, effective multilateralism, and it is sure that this emerging world order will not be, Adrian, you said it in your statement, this the order we know. We have new conditions, we have new facts on to construct this world order, with a bigger part to the emerging world or the global south. So we have to discuss on what we mean when we say we want to construct a better global governance. This is the task of the future, because without agreeing on what this means, we will not resolve the world problems as underdevelopment, climate change, poverty, gender issues, etc. But so I think we are just at the starting point to tackle this discussion. What does it mean in the 21st century with a world with 7 billion people? How can we assure our future with regard to climate change, nutrition, and all this? So this is a huge challenge, and I do not know the answer, but I only know, or I think that I know that all these evolution must follow a way of respect of human rights, etc. And this is one point I want to make with my colleague Jiang Hong. When you said China, and you quoted David Harvey, China has a version of neoliberalism. This addresses a purely economic word of neoliberalism, the economic neoliberalism. This is not a liberal world order, which means more or less based on democratic rule. This, once again, I think we use terms, we do not speak of the same things, because neoliberalism is a completely different thing than a democratic world order. And I just remain convinced that democracy is not a perfect, but the best available order. Adrian remembered us that what it is very important to take into account the desire and the action of the civil society. But a civil society can only prosper in the framework of a liberal democratic order. If not, they are not heard. They cannot express themselves. So even this argument of Adrian, that we should have a deeper look at civil society, means, yes, we have to strengthen the democratic governance. There is no other way to take into account the will and the desires and need of civil society. There is not a very vivid civil society in an authoritarian regime. That does not exist. So if you want to listen and to have a vivid civil society, yes, you have to push democratic democratic rule further. I do not see an alternative. But we should have the further opportunities to discuss on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gisela. Caroline, please.
Yeah, I fully agree with Gisela on her last points. Who would have guessed? And I also want to thank you for organizing this this event. It was great to have this discussion, and I'm extremely happy that our Chinese friend could join us, and it was very interesting to hear your point of view on that. I can't go too deep into your questions, but just let me take one of your points. You said the European point is problematic. You talked about European arrogance and the problematic stance by establishing the European neighborhood policy. I have not heard you say who is the real rule breaker in this game of the Ukraine crisis. So it was Russian aggression that spurred this crisis and the annexation of a sovereign country. And I think this is a very important point that we should make when we take the Ukraine crisis as a case in point. And yes, there were definitely mistakes in the setting up of European neighborhood policy, definitely. And you could extend that to Turkey, for example. Election policy with Turkey is a number of zigzags, ups and downs, and not being really on a clear stance towards this country. And this caused a lot of problems. But, and I want to underline that again, the EU is the new kid on the block of geopolitics. So maybe let's wait and see. Europe gets better. It's not perfect. This is for sure. But I think it's worthwhile working together and also have sorts of discussions like that, because as we can see, different notions, different terms evoke different notions in our head, and it's not the societies, but also academia who should stay in a real close contact like that to overcome differences and to try to cope with those problems without passports. Isn't this the famous UN notion, the problems without passports, that are the big challenge for the 21st century and for global governance? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. Tianhong, please, your final thoughts, and then we'll finish up. Your mic is on mute. No. Okay. Oh, unfortunately, the connection is not working again. But let me thank you. I think John has made a couple of points that will provoke a new round of discussions between us all. And with this different perspectives from Latin America, Europe, and China, and other parts of the world, that everyone is expecting what will be the next stage, the next steps from the European Union and the European societies, as Adrian has put, towards this emerging global order. I thank you very much, all our panelists and the audience, for today's presentations. And I hope to see you tomorrow morning for the next panel. And thank you, and good night, good morning.